Hi everyone, it's Courtney with Simon Hurley Create, and today we're going to be using the Jewel Heist background stamp as well as one of the sentiments from the Flower Picking Friends stamp set. So I'm going to bring out my misti here because obviously this is a background stamp, and you'll see that I have a huge piece of cardstock here. This is much larger than an A2 size card, but this way I can fit my background stamp right in the corner of my misti because I'm going to be stamping this later on, and I want to keep my stamp in one place and not have to worry about trying to position my paper. So I'm going to trim down my paper when everything is all said and done, so it's just easier to cut it a little bit larger than needed. So I am going to be using Blackout ink by Ink on 3. I'm going to be doing some Copic coloring, but you can use any medium that you choose for this. It's kind of making a geometric type background, which is not exactly my strong point, but I'm playing around. I'm kind of going outside my comfort zone lately. So I ended up stamping this, I think a total of 3 times because I wanted a really bold black image or outline around each one of these little images. Now, I get a ton of questions about my favorite Copic combinations. I know I've done previous videos about my Copic combinations that I typically go to, but I figured every once in a while it may be good to kind of combine them all into one card so that you guys can see the combinations that I most often use, at least. So I'm going to be using some rainbow colors here. I'm going to start off with my reds, and you'll notice for each one I am starting with the lightest color, and I'm just getting the paper a little bit saturated. This is the Stark White cardstock by Simon Hurley Create, by the way. And I may have said it was Nina Solar White because I'm used to saying it, but it's not. It's Stark White. So then I go in with my darkest color, which is typically a lot darker than I want my image to be in order to get that contrast. I'm using just straight lines here. There's no flicking, no anything. And I'm just leaving the highlight towards the center for the R22 in this case. And I'm being careful when I go in with my lightest color to not go over the darkest areas. That a lot of times is maybe the problem if you're not getting a good blend, because when you go over the darker areas with your lightest color is going to almost act as a colorless blender and move that color in places that you don't want it to be, and it's going to mute it a lot. So that may be an issue that you may be having if you're having a hard time blending. So next I'm going to move on to the orange combination here, and you can see that I started off again with the lightest color, and my darkest color is actually an E marker. It's more of a reddish brownish color. Whenever I do shading with oranges or yellows, I'll typically bring in an E marker or a YR marker for the Ys. You'll also notice that my highlight color is a yellow. So there's a lot of different combinations that I use for orange depending on what orange you want, whether you want it to be bright or more subtle or kind of a rusty color. So next is the yellows, and I'm going to bring in a YR marker for my darkest color. Yellows can be really tough to get contrast with because they're all bright. Yellows are always bright. So it's very hard with bright colors to get contrast. So oftentimes I will bring in a YR marker, like I said, depending on what you're looking for. If you're looking to keep that brightness of the yellow, I'd use a YR marker. If you're looking for more of a golden yellow, you may want to try some of your E markers, so some of the neutral tones. So next up is the green combination, and I actually ended up changing this after this first one because I just wasn't getting enough contrast, just because I felt like these particular images, you kind of need a lot to give them some shape, and I really wasn't getting it. So right now I'm using a YG06 as my lightest color throughout the rest of the card, which I'm not going to show you all of them. I'm just going to show you one of each. I ended up switching to a YG03 for the lightest just to get a little bit more contrast. And for this one, you'll see that I go back in with that darkest color just to add a little bit more shadow, and I don't blend it out. And that helped a little bit as well. So next up for the blue combination, this one's kind of hanging off the page. And quite honestly, I didn't know how far I was going to need to color out to the sides or up and down at this point. I probably should have measured it and kind of marked it off with a pencil, but I didn't. I just kept coloring away. And when I trimmed it down, you'll see in a minute, I needed to color a little bit more. But doing the same thing with the blue combination, starting off with that lightest color. Same thing for this purple combination here. And normally I would stop at the purples. These would be my rainbow colors. However, the way the stamp was laid out, or actually the way I stamped it and the way I began coloring it, I was going to have a red right underneath the other red, and I didn't want that. So I ended up bringing in a RV combination, which I don't typically use for rainbow, but I just didn't want those reds to be touching or directly next to one another. So I'm going to do the same thing with that, going in with the RV21 first as my lightest color to get the paper saturated, then the RV29, 25, 23, then the 21 again. By now you guys know exactly how I'm coloring these. I mainly just kept this in so that you can see the color combinations that I use, whether or not you're just starting your Copic collection or looking to expand it. So I went ahead and continued up all of the coloring for almost the entire panel, at least what I thought I was actually going to need for my card before trimming it down. And I didn't want a white background. I didn't want my paper to remain white. I wanted it black because I wanted these images to really, really pop. So I'm going to take my black Copic marker and I'm just going to color in between all of these images. This did not take as long as it seems like it may have taken. If you don't have a black Copic marker, use a black Sharpie. It doesn't really matter, just as long as it's black, or even a darker color if you want to use like a navy blue or whatever you want. I just figured that using black makes your images really, really pop, and I wanted them to really, really pop. So I was just careful not to go over my images. Now I'm using an alcohol marker. I colored my images with an alcohol marker. So you have to be super careful that you're not going directly over your images. Alcohol inks will automatically start blending together. So if you go over your images at all, it may start to kind of bleed into those images, and you don't want that to happen. So it's looking a little crazy right now, but before we cut this down, I'm going to restamp it. So I'm going to line it right back in my misti, and I'm going to treat the panel with my anti-static tool. Now, one of the great things about this background stamp, and many of Simon's background stamps, is they come apart. So you don't have to use it as a background stamp. So I am going to remove the top and the bottom and leave the middle strip there. And I'm trying to just make sure that it doesn't budge at all. And this time I'm going to stamp it with Versamark ink. I did stamp it twice, even though I could tell that I got a pretty good impression the first time. I didn't want to take any chances because I didn't want to have to try to line this up again and just hope and pray that it works. So I did stamp it twice just to make sure that I got really good coverage. And then I sprinkled on some white embossing powder. You can use any color embossing powder that you want. I just figured I wanted the middle of the panel to really stand out. This is where I'm going to put my sentiment. Like I said, this is definitely not something I'm used to making. This is a lot different than my typical cards. So I'm just playing, basically. I'm just experimenting. So I went ahead and heated up my heat gun. You want to make sure that you have it heated up for about 30 seconds or so before bringing it to your card panel. That way it will minimize the amount of warping. The Stark White cardstock is pretty heavy duty. I typically don't have too much of a problem with it warping anyway. Now I have a lot of dust from my anti-static tool. I'm just going to wipe this away with a microfiber cloth, but I want my embossing powder to be completely cool. If you don't wait until it cools down, you're just going to smear it. It only takes a couple of seconds. Now I can go ahead and trim down my panel, and I'm kind of just playing around here to make sure that I don't cut off too much and that I have at least a little bit of each one of these little jewels or whatever you want to call them showing so that my rainbow kind of flows together. Realize that I did not color enough, but I did end up trimming it down just a little bit more than an A2 size card. That way when I glue it down to my card base, I have a little bit of a white border. Again, this will really make it pop as well. So next I'm just going to take some of the same Copic markers I used, but I'm not going to do any shading here, just to fill in these bottom little pieces that are kind of peeking through of the gems that would be above. Not really worried about shading. Now for my sentiment, I'm going to be using one of the sentiments from the Flower Picking Friends stamp set. And there's a lot of kind of basic sentiments in the stamp set, so it's a good one to have on hand. I'm just going to use the Just For You sentiment, and that's going to go right there in the center. I'm going to glue down my panel down to my A2 size card base, just leaving a little bit of a border. And for my sentiment, I'm going to heat emboss this onto some black cardstock. And I, once again, treated this with my anti-static tool, stamped out the sentiment with Versamark ink, sprinkled on some white embossing powder, and went ahead and heat set that. Now, I don't want to cut this into a regular old strip because there's a lot of loops, I guess you could call them, within this sentiment. So I'm going to cut around the sentiment, almost like I'm fussy cutting, but I'm just going to leave a little bit of a border as if I used a word die. So this is kind of thick cardstock. This black cardstock that I have is pretty heavy weight. So I like to kind of trim off any excess that is hanging off the edges or kind of getting in my way as I'm trying to fussy cut. So don't be afraid to cut little pieces off as you go if it makes your fussy cutting a little bit easier. And you just want to kind of keep your scissors somewhat straight and move the paper around with your less dominant hand. So before adhering this, I wanted to add a little bit of shimmer. Well, I wanted to add a whole lot of shimmer. So I'm taking a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen and I'm adding a whole lot of shimmer to each one of these little jewels here. And then I can finally pop up my sentiment in the center. There we go. And that is it. That is the card for today, guys. As always, I will leave the very few supplies that I used in the description box below. Thanks so much for stopping by today and have a great day. Bye.